salvation, working out our salvation with fear and trembling. And so we want to complete that today or for this week. And we'll be dealing with the same subject, working out our salvation or your salvation. So in the verse in Philippians, chapter 1, verse 12 through 16, we read, and we'll look at the other half of this lesson. So then, my beloved, even as you always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without murmuring and questionings, that you may become blameless and harmless children of God, that in the midst of a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you're seen as lights in the world, holding forth the word of light or life, that you may have whereof the glory, that in the day of Christ, that I did not run in vain, neither labored in vain. Well, today, so we're looking then at the lesson for today, working out our salvation with fear and trembling. So we need to get involved now. And so the thing that we're looking at today is working out our salvation without murmuring and without questioning. So can we do God's will without murmuring and questioning in today's world? And yet we recognize that some murmured and question everything in life. Their whole life is about murmuring and questioning. Wherever they are and whatever is quiet of them, they're murmuring and complaint, questioning about the weather. Oh, maybe it is too hot. It's too cold. Maybe it is too humid. Well, but the saints of God says that we should work out our salvation without murmuring and questioning. Well, some, they complain about the government. The taxes too high. Don't like who is in the office. Don't respect those that are in the office that I don't like. Well, it may be the preacher. His sermon is not good enough. And because of that, he's not helping the church. It may be that the church, that everybody in the church are wicked and none are good. But the saints receive an imperative command that we must work out our salvation without murmuring and questioning it in this life. We are encouraged not to murmur against one another. In James 5, verse 8 and 9, be ye also patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Murmur not, brethren, one against another, that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge stands before the door, working out your salvation without questioning, that you may become blameless and harmless children of God in the midst of a crooked and perverted generation. Well, if you will only take time to follow the instruction of God, the reason God's children are blameless and harmless because they are not involved in murmuring, and they are not involved in murmuring in secrets about submission to the will of God. They recognize and they know that they must be in submission to God's will. So they don't murmur, neither do they complain about that anymore, because they don't question God's will. They know that God's will is better than the president and Congress, and better than any other will. God's will is the best will that any man can obey. And they do not murmur and complain because they don't argue over scruples. In Romans 14, verse number 7, argue about who eat meats and who do not eat meats. And one who eat meats are better than the one who does not. Or one who eats the vegetables are better than the one that eats meat. God's children do not get involved in scruples. Neither they argue about the significance of one day over another day. They do not argue about whether you like this day and they like that day. Now they like God's day, and that is upon the first day of the week, and that the saints to come together to break bread. Well, we shouldn't regard one day over another. Well, because, beloved, that leads us not to murmuring and in complaining. An example of blameless and harmless children of God. And I remember Job. Remember how in Job's behavior, how that he, in fact, in Job 1, in verse 1 and 2, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was a perfect and upright man, one that feared God and turned away from evil. We hear four qualities about this man that did not allow him to spend his life but instead he was involved in accomplishing God's will. Number one, he was a perfect man. That is to say, mature. He was an upright man. That is, he followed the will of God. He was one who feared God with his house, and he turned away from evil. These are qualities that all of us can possess today, to be perfect in what we do, and upright, and to fear God, and to turn away from evil. Those who are living their lives without murmuring and questioning, and they are lights in this world. And nobody can doubt that this world does not need lights. In every corner of America, and there needs to be a light that shines on the love of God. The Bible encourages us that we, ye are the light of the world, a city that set up on a hill that cannot be hid. And neither do men light a lamp and put it up on the bushel, but on the stand. And it shines to all that are in the house. And even so, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. So those who live a life without murmuring and complaining, and they know that they are the light of the world, and they hold fast the word of truth, that they may not, that they may have whereof the glory in the day of judgment. And let me tell you that the day of judgment is going to come. Christ is coming back to this world. We need to live a life without murmuring and complaining about one another. And in Philippians 2, in verse 15, that ye may become blameless and harmless children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you're seen as lights in the world. Well, beloved, we need to rejoice and in this do whatever we can, and in this life to do as God has instructed us, holding fast the word of life, that we may have whereof the glory in the day of judgment. Now, holding fast the word of life, and that I may have whereof the glory. This is Paul speaking in the day of Christ, that I did not run in vain, and neither did I labor in vain. And they who spend their lives, beloved, without murmuring and in complaining, well, and they learn to rejoice in the midst of a crooked and perverted generation. It is that anybody today that would affirm that this world is not a crooked and perverted generation where people are shooting down one another, and as they do, rabbits sit in the field, and they shoot not one or two, five or six. Well, if we live a life without murmuring and complaining, well, we rejoice in the midst of this crooked generation because we know that Christ is on our sides, that you may become blameless and harmless children of God, without blemish, and in the midst of a crooked and perverted generation, among whom you're seen as lights in the world. More than that, beloved, and they are harmless and wise as serpents in this life. You know, Jesus sent out his apostles, and he said, listen, you go out harmless and wise as serpent. Those who are children of God, and they are wise, beloved, and they are harmless and wise as serpent. In other words, they see the wrong. They know the wrong, but they are not ready to hurt it in anyone. In Matthew 10, verse 16, behold, I send you forth as sheep, and in the midst of a crooked, in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpent, and harmless as doves. So we learn, beloved, as God's children, to be sheep. But yet that doesn't mean that we're dumb, that we're wise as serpents, beloved, that we know right from wrong. Murmuring and numbering the blameless, and in the harmless children of God, in the midst of a living a blameless and harmless life. So then, beloved, that is what God requires. So then, they should, even as ye have always obeyed, Paul says to the Philippians, not as in my presence only, so you were harmless and blameless, even in my absence, but not much more are you in my presence. Work out your own soul salvation with fear and trembling. Learn to be vigilant, and you have humility, humbleness, and that God may bless you in this life. And in 1 Corinthians 2, in verse number 3, and I was with you in weakness, in fear, and much trembling. Ephesians 6, verse 5. Serve and be obedient unto them that is according to the flesh, or your masters, in fear and tremble, and singleness of heart as unto the Christ. We, beloved, in this life, we should be without murmuring and without complaining, that we may become blameless and harmless children of God to make a difference wherever we are in life, whether in home, whether on job, or whether in career, wherever we are. And it is God who works in us, both to will and into work. And we couldn't get anything done if God was not working it in our hearts. Well, and it is he who works in us for his good pleasure. So God wants you to succeed. He wants you to be victorious in whatever you do, because that shines a light over God and over his attitude and disposition. 2 Peter 1 and verse 10, wherefore, brethren, give the more diligence to make your calling and election sure. For if you do these things, ye shall never stumble. And if you follow the teaching of the Lord, doing all things without murmuring and without questioning. Remember that the children of Israel, the thousands of them perished in the wilderness because they were involved in murmuring against God and against Moses. In 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 10, neither murmur ye, as some of them murmured and perished by the destroyer, and that you may become blameless. In John 17 and John 7 and verse 17, and if any man willeth to do his will, he shall know of the teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak of myself. Well, beloved, we need to live a life that we're without murmuring and without complaining, that we may become blameless and harmless children of God in the midst of a crooked and perverted generation. There are more churches that are disturbed because there's somebody there murmuring and complaining, somebody there talking and condemning everything. Same thing about many homes. They're in all kinds of trouble because, beloved, there is somebody involved in disturbing the place. Well, I say to you today that children, we are children of God, and we should live a life without having blame and not being crooked in every manner. We need to hold forth the word of life, that we may have whereof the glory in the day of judgment, that we will not run in vain, and that we will not labor in vain, that God will ultimately bless us with all that we do in this world. Well, it's a wonderful thing then to work out our own soul salvation in fear and trembling, and that is without murmuring and without questioning, and in addition to that, and that is without working out our salvation with an understanding heart that God worked in Christian both to will and to do. And finally, that we may recognize and know that God, beloved, will bless those who work for him without murmuring and without complaining, that they may become blameless and harmless children of God and in this beautiful world that God has given us. Well, today we look forward to seeing you then on next week.